Please join me in welcoming Mr. Simon Mijolovic. He's the founder and CTO of CHAaSM.com. Mr. Simon, welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir. How are you?
Very well. Let's talk about ransomware legislation, public policy impacts 2021. We got some, let's just say interesting things on the horizon. Let's talk about them.
Yeah, sure. Well, obviously, cybersecurity has been a major prevailing threat. If you look at how the 2016 elections started to impact the way that the perception was beginning to change around the world with regards to how cybersecurity can have direct impacts on political stability, financial stability, and even core infrastructure, right? As we started to see more and more infrastructure attacks. There was obviously the need for legislative action, and across the globe, we've started to see a profound change and shift in terms of policy direction regarding how we combat many of these different types of ways, whether it be state-sponsored agencies that are perpetrating specific types of nefarious attacks, or in the case of lone wolf actors or small communities or small groups of hackers that are leveraging mechanisms for financial purposes. And one of the major things that we've seen fairly recently is a move towards taking away the financial bite. So making it difficult for companies to actually pay ransoms in order to be able to regain access to information, and forcing companies to be a little bit more proactive in threat prevention of ransomware, so that they don't become the victims and don't find themselves in these positions of choice. So pushing legislation in a way that incentivizes companies to take a more aggressive approach towards preventing it from happening in the first place. Now, legislation at times can move us in the wrong direction, but also in most cases, I see it moving us in a way that may have some unintended consequences that actually benefit us. In fact, we've seen that fairly recently, where there's been a lot of activity with federal agencies working to take down a significant number of high priority services that allowed ransomware attacks to propagate the financial funnels. So taking down a lot of the servers that were allowing these encryption processes to happen, connected to the Bitcoin frameworks, allowing them to be able to then collect cash or collect electronic currency as ransoms. Taking those things down certainly definitely help. And it's interesting because we've seen a number of them go down over the last couple of weeks. And while the legislation may not have expected to have that consequence, I do believe that there was some correlation between the two events.
Let me get your thoughts on this. In 2020, U.S. Treasury Department threatened financial penalties against companies that paid ransomware to hackers, right? So I see both sides of this. I see, we want to discourage hacking by letting hackers know that companies are not going to pay because they'll get penalized. On the other hand, I got to get my business up and running, or I got no money to pay the IRS with.
Right. There's definitely arguments on both sides of the equation. And that's why it makes it very difficult sometimes to draft this type of legislation, mainly because of the fact that, regardless of who you penalize, you will have those corner cases where there is the unintended consequence, where the true victims or people that aren't aware of the fact that they are vulnerable or at risk find themselves in a situation where they might get penalized. So I do definitely understand both sides of the equation. We definitely see where more of what we expect legislation to do is focus on more of the criminality of the events. So people who are actually engaging in the ransom activities, and increasing penalties and fines for those that do commit those types of crimes, as well as looking at more of the global legislation around sanctions against nation state sponsors of that type of nefarious activity. So, while this type of legislation can hurt various organizations who find themselves in a position where they do get hacked, or are using a technology and are unaware of the fact that there's something that's vulnerable within it that makes them a victim of a ransomware attack. Or even more broadly, the fact that you have cloud infrastructure and dependencies on a public cloud that you don't manage and you're not aware of with regards to any of the vulnerabilities or ways in which those can be hacked or breached, winds up making you feel like you're the victim, or a company, I should say, the victim of legislation that hurts or criminalizes them for being in a position where they have to get access to their data again. And again, we believe that the intention of that legislation is really to focus in on getting companies to have better hygiene around, okay, you may have been ransomware, but do you have an effective backup and DR solution that allows you to instantaneously go back to a snapshot of a previously known good image so that you can immediately restore your environment? So, instead of losing maybe days or weeks of data, you might have lost an hour or two of data. And coming up with those levels of compromises that create good cybersecurity hygiene for disaster recovery and what we call continuity of operations is an important thing. And I think that that's what that legislation intends to do. But there is that unintended consequence sometimes where a company is unexpected and they become a victim of an attack and they have no way of getting back because they didn't have that level of hygiene.
So the SolarWinds hack wasn't ransomware, but it shined a spotlight
That's
on the
right.
important. But it did shine, it shined a spotlight on the important role that cybersecurity plays in national security. So to your point, I hear you. I would like to see more of the legislation that criminalizes this stuff. It makes it easier for local law enforcement to do something about it. On the other hand, it's the net. Everything's connected. Everything is interdependent on each other, right? So shouldn't this really be more of a national security issue? Shouldn't we have the military involved in protecting the business down the street? Because that's what the ultimate
100%
attacks are, right?
Great question. And just in any situation where you're looking at how financial services or impact to our financial economy can have impact and effect on our national security, those all need to be intertwined. And we believe that, in fact, the government is taking a far more proactive approach now than it ever has to recognizing the need for the government to be able to play an active role, and not just litigation or not just you leveraging the Department of Justice or the Department of Treasury, but in fact becoming more of a member in producing software code so that they understand that there is a lack of prioritization when it comes to all of the software code that's being written. You have to really think about it as we've scaled out in this cloud world, especially in this public cloud world. The numbers are staggering when you look at over 110 billion lines of code being produced now each year, and that there's over 4 million shortage in security personnel for people to actually be able to inspect that code to see if there are any systemic bad coding practices or vulnerability. It's now at a point where we cannot trust code and software infrastructure. This whole idea of leveraging any kind of trust or referring to anything as secure is the popular misnomer we need to get past. But more importantly, the government will become and is continuing to become more actively involved in looking at software code, looking at the maintenance of particularly open source code and the code that they're using and consuming for not just, the mom and pop's flower shop, but also that same kind of code that's being used on weapon systems, on ships, on planes. So it all is an interdependency and an intertwining because, we're not an internet of things. We're an internet of threats. And when you look at it that way, we do have to take a more active role, not just in industry in prioritizing security, but in fact, the government really needs to become actively involved because it's the government that can supply a mechanism of accountability. It's very difficult to take your intellectual property producers, right, your best developers in your best companies that write software, and say, you've had 5 security issues in your code, and fire them, right? Because replacing that one asset is not a one-for-one replacement. That person may have been doing the job of hundreds, if not thousands of people within a company. So it's very difficult to prioritize security when the real motivation is about, generating a product that generates profit, that generates revenue. The government has a very different approach, right? The government is in the business of national security, protect and defense, right? And in order to be able to do that, it takes a different mindset that says my priority is not making money. My priority is either saving lives or preventing people from being attacked. And that's something that is a fundamental difference. And that's why we believe that the government needs to be actively involved in every stage of the process, not just in product development, but actually, key intellectual property production in the federal space. We see that moving in that direction. It's also about situational awareness too. It's a big piece of any type of force protection strategy, right? And if you equate what you do in the physical force protection space, there's a lot of analogies towards how you apply that same type of mentality in a cyber world, right? Because you're obviously layered defense. Is such a fundamental aspect of physical security. It's not just about having a gate and a guard. It's about having, people that are protecting the ship, people that are protecting the port, people that are protecting the perimeter of the port. You have all of these different layers of defense that you apply in a physical sense. And in moving that into the digital world is, a very big part of what we refer to as the defense in depth model, right? Where you don't expect that one particular area is going to be able to provide comprehensive defense. The only comprehensive defense strategy is defense in layers. So that very same, we use that same analogy in the digital space. But one of the things that you also do planning for is the unintended events, right? The events that you don't plan for, right? So a lot of times you'll stage different type of what's the term I'm looking for? Like an exercise, right? Where you'll have somebody try to attack a defense in a way that's never been attacked before. So a lot of that type of threat profiling is what's necessary in the digital world today. That's one of the things that we focus in on a lot, and that is having situational awareness of what your full threat profile looks like. Because software will never be perfect, but understanding the various areas where you might be vulnerable to risk is another important step of that, and that's the reason why you have things like risk mitigation plans in the physical security space to those types of contingencies where I may have a weakness in a particular perimeter area, a wall got taken down, so I have to now use physical security force protection to control that wall. So it's very analogistic to what you do in that type of space, and it's just applying those same concepts to the digital world. But one of the areas that we suffer from is that lack of threat profiling visibility. It's an area that we focus in on very heavily, and we talk to the government about, and that is the fact that if you know where your threats could come from, the most likely areas to start looking at, but making sure that you have the visibility to see any anomalistic behavior is important, right? That's the reason why you don't have just physical assets. You have closed circuit televisions, you have all kinds of sensors that are looking for, the temperature changes, that are looking for pressure changes, that are looking for different things that can tell you whether or not specific types of attacks are present, right? So again, that's one of the areas that we've lacked in the cybersecurity paradigm, and it's one of the areas that the government is becoming more actively involved in. And actually, you're seeing commercial industry now starting to prioritize this. And you brought up SolarWinds, and it's a very important part of this conversation about not being ransomware based. But we're going to take it back to where it's still applicable. And that is the fact that this type of an attack, the SolarWinds attack, is an attack that we've been talking about for many years at CHAaSM. And that is the supply chain attack, right? So if you don't know how your software is built and you don't have control of the entire build process, then you are susceptible to these types of attacks. And the reason why these attacks are more nefarious is because it's almost impossible for the end user to recognize that this in fact is happening, because they're checking a way of validating whether or not that came from a reliable source. And that information is telling them that it did, right? So there's no way for them to figure out whether or not it did or it didn't. They're trusting on a single entity, which is, a certificate, a digital signed certificate, to tell them whether or not this came from the source they expected it to. So when you have that single line of defense as a mechanism layer with which to tell whether or not somebody's injected code into your environment is extraordinarily dangerous, because of the fact that not only can you pass ransomware in that way, but you can pass in any nefarious code that way. And then the challenge is, because of the fact that it's validated and saying it's coming from a good source, now that's passing across, which what we call east-west traffic, once it comes into the data center. And what you find is that most environments don't use a defense in depth strategy, which protects themselves once something comes into the network boundary. So if it's already inside of your environment, most cases it can easily pass from server to server inside of that infrastructure with little to no resistance. because of the fact that so much emphasis and so much attention is paid on specific layers of defense, for example, at the network layer, but isn't done in a comprehensive defense in-depth strategy. So while ransomware is a challenge that we're solving because of the fact that it has a direct financial implication, the impact and the results of the SolarWinds attack is far more broader and far more reaching, because it can literally inject any kind of malware, ransomware, or more importantly, it could literally install agents that are passing encrypted data that the user or the consumer of technology isn't even aware is happening. So it's like catching a virus you can't see, and it's passing itself from person to person inside of your home, and you have no idea what it is, you have no idea how to stop it, and none of your tricks work. So it's definitely one of the scariest types of ways, and it's a very sophisticated type of an attack. But the challenge is that once that sophistication is accomplished and achieved, the impact is devastating. In fact, we believe that the remnants of this particular SolarWinds attack will never be removed from Azure, GCP, or AWS. And we know that that's a pretty profound and scary statement, but the fact of the matter is that public cloud infrastructure will have remnants of this for a very long time, and they probably will never be able to get rid of it completely.
My hierarchy storage management dumb desktop terminal is looking better and better every day in this brave new world.
Exactly.
I have to say.
Exactly. Well, as you know, the cloud world has moved into this. You must have a multi-cloud strategy, and we completely agree with that, right? But that's usually interpreted to a multi-public cloud strategy. It's okay, I can't put all of my eggs in the AWS basket, so I'm going to spread out my resources evenly between these different public cloud providers. But what we fundamentally are telling the world is that you actually need to have the knowledge of how to build your own cloud if you're a company, and if you're a government agency, and if you're a healthcare environment. So if you're in financial services, if you're in technology, if you're in healthcare, if you're in government agencies, you actually have to learn how to build your own cloud infrastructure, because a dependency on public cloud as to be your be all end all, that is your multi-cloud strategy, does leave you susceptible to a situation where, if there was an attack that took down the vast majority of public cloud infrastructure, would you be able to operate as an organization? So that level of knowledge, and you have to also understand that the vast majority of the public cloud infrastructure that you're using today, the vast majority of that code is open source code that they are using to be able to build their public cloud infrastructures. So the data is already there, the source code is already there. And it's important for agencies and organizations to learn how to be able to do the same amount of things, to build those kinds of things, so that they become self-sufficient and self-reliant. And that's how you're able to maintain operations. And we believe that that's a fundamental practice in building a hybrid cloud or a multi-cloud strategy, is learning how to build your own cloud.
I look at the cloud now as a single point of failure, right? And to your point, if AWS has 80% of the servers in the world, or Google has 80% of the browsers, those are single points of failure. Even if it's 50%, it's a single point of failure to me. Are we looking at this with the wrong perspective? Here's my view. I think we're at war. I think we've been at war for a long time. Nobody's getting blown up, but I got to tell you, if you turn off the grid of the United States for a day, catastrophic. You turn it off for a month or two, bye-bye. Right? I mean, this is far more dangerous than dropping a bomb on somebody like in the old days, right? Well, if businesses understood we're at war, would they step up and act differently to protect themselves?
I think, again, it's very difficult from a business perspective, because they have to look at profitability, what keeps their company operating, right? So a lot of the fundamental challenges is prioritizing which is more important. Is it a strategy that requires a prioritization on security, right, which we see is a rarity today, or is it really about keeping the fundamental process of the business running and operating so that either we can operate at a profit or as profitable as possible? And that leads to a number of different trade-offs. But we believe that in the national interest of security, especially in high governance environments, this topic of conversation is definitely shifting towards the yes, there needs to be a more active prioritization. So we see that there's more and more of an impact, not just on legislation, but also on certifications and competencies that companies are going to need to have in order to be able to do business in these heavily regulated environments, such as industrial control systems, right? Such as federal government systems, such as financial services and systems that are tied to publicly traded companies. We're starting to see this shift where the certification processes and the requirements, the technical requirements, and the business requirements and the security requirements are becoming far more stringent. And we see that that's a move in the right direction. But to see us not at war, I think is ignoring the problem. There's nothing more comprehensively that explains this than the fact that we're looking at a $6 to $10 trillion redistribution of wealth that's coming from cybersecurity. And that is the largest redistribution wealth in the history of our country. And if that doesn't show you that you're at war, nothing else will, because it's not good people, right? It's not people that are fundamentally trying to solve problems that this wealth is going to. This wealth is going to people who are using this technology for nefarious reasons. And that is a dangerous trajectory, and that number is only growing exponentially by the year. So, we have to look at this in that particular way. We have to look at it the way that we would, address an issue from a combat perspective, with both defensive and offensive strategies to protect our core infrastructure. And that's 100% true that, I think your law enforcement background gives you that spidey sense. That very many of the people who work in industry just don't have, right? And that is the fact that this is so aggressive and antagonistic in nature and has such a financial impact that to not see it as a combative threat is to ignore the problem.
I agree with you 100%, Simon. I come at it with that exact look because on one hand, people have an argument. Money's not everything. We have to look at more of social things. And I say, you know what? Okay. I get it. But you know what? With no money, you can't do any social things. You can't do anything. And, money is good and evil. I get it. But we have to start with a point where we understand that if they take our banks down, people are going to die. If they take our electricity down, people are going to die. Far more than a traditional war. Now, let me ask you this. Is there one group of people that's not catching on to help move this stuff along?
It's hard to say that there's one group of people. I think it's more of there's a cost benefit analysis that happens in companies, right? And I think that's where the fundamental challenge lies. I think there are members of C-suite who definitely see the prioritization, and I also think that you have C-suite members that really understand the risk to the business if we are susceptible to this, or we become the victim of an attack, right? Because if you look at the financial impact that it has, right? I can name some names, right? Look at the impact that just an attack had to an Equifax, what it had to an Anthem, a Blue Cross Blue Shield, what it happened, and anybody who, Capital One and any of these companies suffered majorly from breaches, right? So there is that risk that is inherently calculated. And that's the reason why I see some encouragement, because you do see C-suite inclusion of chief information risk officers, which I think work very well hand in hand with C-suite that is focused in on security, because the risk benefit analysis sways better in the security bucket when you have somebody who really does understand the impact of financial risk. But I do also think, like I said before, you see the challenges of the cost benefit analysis of what it costs operationally. Security people aren't cheap, right? Security assets aren't cheap. Security tooling isn't cheap. And getting all of that to work together isn't cheap. So there is an impact that it has to the business. And I think that's where there's the major shift in focus. People are starting to realize I need to make that investment versus I can make that investment later versus I cannot afford to make that investment. And that's where, again, where there's the shortfall of having engineering staff that's easy to find. So it becomes more expensive when it's more rare. So leveraging and engaging in a technology, right? So a lot of new advances in this environment is making it easier for companies to go in and say, okay, I can leverage more of a balance between automation and people and start bringing this into my company. And that's where we see most of the world going, is that they're starting to make, if they haven't made initial investments, they're definitely stepping up, and a considerable percentage of budget is now being shifted into cyber protection, risk management, and really understanding the impact that taking a good proactive stance on security has to the to the positivity and the positive impact of business. So we're seeing that shift happen today. So I think it's definitely changing, but it is a slow moving process, right? And the larger the company, the longer it takes for that wheel to move forward. So I would say that the tide is turning in the right direction. But I will also say that insurance and litigation and liability elimination, so what we refer to as, and I'm going to get a little legal here, indemnification, I would say is probably the most problematic part of this. Literally, you have companies debating what's more expensive, a staff that can prevent me from this, or an insurance policy that says if I get hacked, up to $10 million will be covered by this insurance policy. That's where I see what I would call the negative impact, right? Is that a lot of people are leaning on, or a lot of companies will lean on the fact that they can use an insurance policy or a cybersecurity insurance policy in order to be able to underwrite the risk of not having this proactive security defense. And what's happening now, and I think this is a positive step in the right direction to prevent that type of thing from becoming more of a risk, is that they're writing even more into the policies that say, if you don't make this investments, then this insurance policy is null and void. So there has to be clauses within the insurance policies that are ensuring companies that they're not using that as an umbrella to essentially not invest in preventing the risk and just using it as an insurance blanket.
Are we getting to a point where legislation is going to step up and say, you know what? You guys didn't do anything. You are therefore negligent per se. You're going to get sued because you could have and should have done a minimum thing. You could have put Norton on your computer and you didn't do that. And therefore, you're liable.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that, we're moving in the direction where negligence is no longer a defensible response. And it's taken a long time for us to get there. But the fact of the matter is that eventually we knew we had to get there. I think we're at a point today where, if we look at, for example, the comprehensive approach, especially if you look at over the last few weeks that we're taking to work interagency and address, the systemic challenges of delivering a vaccine in such a fast way for these types of threats with regards to our physical health. If we take that type of an approach, that whole approach to cybersecurity, we're going to be able to see the same types of successes that we're going to see in the medical industry and the vast amount of advances that we've seen in the medical industry. I mean, the idea that somebody would fathom the concept of a pandemic having 6 vaccinations in a year is almost unheard of. And that's what shows how the power of combining the World Health Organizations as a whole working together, and also technology working together to be able to solve a common problem is how we can address these types of issues. And I think that we're going to find that climate change is in that bucket, but cybersecurity needs to be included in that bucket as well. And I think that while a lot of people are focusing in on the fact that the current administration is talking about investing tens of billions of dollars into cybersecurity, it's more about the fact of its prioritization at the executive level, not only of government, but the executive level of our defense departments, our executive level of law enforcement departments, and the executive level of commercial industry, is how you comprehensively solve this type of a systemic challenge.
Simon, I got to say, when I have conversations with people at your level, 2 things happen. I go, oh, wow, I feel real good about this guy being in charge of something. Then I go, oh, my stomach hurts because you've opened my eyes to all kinds of problems I didn't really think about. Let's talk about the zero trust concept. I'm going to go back to my physical security days. I'm at Disney Studios. You don't come in. That's the rule. Nobody gets in the studio unless we know who you are. That's the zero trust model. And then we had to clear you. Talk about why zero trust works so well now in the cyber world, and really This is the only place to be.
So, we look at, and I'll talk a little bit about the zero trust model so that, it's very easy to understand conceptually. But we're going to take it even further than that at a higher level first by just saying the idea of what we call trust nothing architecture is the fundamental concept that is very important in a defense in depth model. And that is the fact that nothing should be trusted in a particular environment, right? We frequently will say things in the security world that becomes very confusing in a layman's sense. When we say trust but verify, well, what does that really mean, right? In our particular case, we ask the same question. Well, what does that mean, right? When in fact, you're basically saying, okay, I'm going to trust that knock on the door is somebody without actually looking out the window and looking at somebody's face and seeing if it is the person that I think it is, right? So trust that the person that's coming to the door is the person I expect it to be is fundamentally flawed. So we don't like that whole idea of, and we don't even like using those types of terms, trusted or secured, because it creates this false sense of protection that in most cases doesn't exist. What the zero trust security model does is it basically effectively says that no input that's coming to me from an outside source is trusted. So when you stick a key in the door, do I trust that key, right? It's that fundamental concept. When you look at how hard it is to get into like a building, when you have various layers of physical security, like for example, getting on a military base, right? Not only do you have guards at the front door that are checking a list, making sure that you actually have either orders or have a visitor's pass to be able to even get on the grounds, is just one of many layers of protection before you even get into a building, right? So not only do you have to clear that environment and go through a series of cones and or blocks of concrete reinforcements, but then in order to be able to get into a physical building, you have to have a badge, right? And then you have to punch in a PIN code to that badge, which verifies the information on that badge. And that is a physical, it's a physical representation of what a zero trust model is, right? So my goal is to get to an application, right? And think of that application as a person inside of that building. In order to get to that app, I have to go through those various layers to be able to know that I am trusted enough, or I have the appropriate credentials. Now, I don't want to say trust, but have the appropriate credentials, and I've gone through the appropriate measures to show that it would be almost impossible for anybody to be able to have all of those 3, 4, 5 things at the same time to gain access to just that one thing, right? Whereas in the old days, if I had those 3 or 4 layers, I could see everything, right? And that's what the zero trust model fundamentally differentiates. It's taking an app, an individual application, and think of it as simple as the application you want to use on your iPhone, and making that only accessible to you, right? That is what the zero trust model is all about, is making sure that when I want to give you access to one specific thing, that I don't trust just one layer, I don't trust just 2 layers. I will never allow you to come and talk to that application unless all of those boundaries and all of those requirements have been met.
Simon, tell me about some technologies out there that really knock it out of the park nowadays. I heard about a ransomware kill switch. And the second I heard that, not knowing anything about it, I said, I got to have one of those. It just sounds like a great idea. Tell me about it.
Well, I said the same thing when I started learning a little bit about Airgap's technology. And they are definitely one of the companies that is on my radar with regards to taking a very different approach to understanding the fact that it's not an if but a when it comes to specific types of attack, and they've really focused in on the ability to be able to use what they call a ransomware kill switch, which is when they identify anomalistic pattern behavior, they have the ability to prevent that from propagating across other components of your infrastructure. So it really does effectively prevent that malware or ransomware from spreading across east-west traffic. And we think that is not only a fundamental concept or an approach that should be taken to combat ransomware in a more proactive way, but we do think that whole idea of being able to monitor and be able to stop anomalistic pattern behaviors across east-west traffic at every layer is a fundamental concept of a defense in depth strategy that we see many technologies moving forward and moving towards in the future. We think that they've been, sort of 3 years ahead in that particular space in terms of thinking about the fact that the problem is eventually going to happen. So it's not a, hey, we're going to prevent it from ever happening. We think that that's a misperception. It's I'm going to get breached. I'm going to most likely have a ransomware event. How do I prevent it from spreading as soon as I'm able to detect it? And do I have a proactive way of detecting it so that I can immediately be notified of any type of a nefarious activity that makes me say, okay, regardless of whether or not I know this is good or not, I'm going to hit the kill switch on this now. We're going to stop this process from running. We're going to inspect it more to make sure that it is or it isn't something that we want to have running in our environment. So it's that kind of behavior that we think allows companies to be more agile and more nimble about their defense in depth strategies. So we definitely think that that's something that we haven't seen before, and we do definitely like as part of a trust nothing architectural approach of, this isn't an if, this is a when.
Simon, give me a couple pointers. The average person's listening to this saying, you know what, I got to get started on this. Where do they start? Where do they start adopting a new model, a new belief system?
Yeah. Well, first off, the belief system is don't trust anything. I know it seems so simple, but it's so true. I can give you, literally personal examples of identity theft, phishing scams to my family, and how easy they are to do. Anybody who calls you on the phone and says, I need to verify social security number, date of birth, name, and driver's license number is an immediate no-go, because there is no company in the world that's going to ask you for that information in all at the same time. So anytime you're being asked for that, know right away that, especially if they call you, right? If they call you asking for that information, know right away that that's not something you should trust, right? So it's having that apprehensive approach that is important for the layperson. When you get an email, right, even if it's from someone you know, look at the link before you click it so that you can see, is it coming from someplace that I know looks good in nature? Or if I see stuff that I've never seen before, my common sense should tell me that's probably something I shouldn't click on, right? Those are two fundamentally important things that a layperson, can do to be able to protect themselves. And that is like, just fundamentally understanding that any implicit layer of trust you provide is most likely your gut telling you, I probably shouldn't be doing this. And following your gut in those cases is something that most of us security people, that's inherent to us. But we do know that it's very easy when you're looking at an email to just click on something because it looks like it came from a particular company, or it looks like it came from a trusted source. But the information that they're asking for is something that a company normally wouldn't ask for.
Simon Mijolovic, he's the founder, president, and CTO of CHAaSM.com. Mr. Simon, fascinating conversation. Overall, I'm going to give you my stomach feels better. That's my rating. Okay.
Great.
Just a little bit on the side of good, because it's interesting to look at this stuff from 30,000 feet and see that we're all connected. Everybody's interdependent on everybody else, and we really got to work together to get this fixed, because if we don't, it's just going to be worse than 2020. Let's put it that way, if that's even possible. So thanks again for coming on the show. Really appreciate it, my friend.
Thank you. Take care.